I'm Laura Thompson, the board chair of the Kota Alliance. And Jaana Rehnstrom, the president and founder of the Kota Alliance, asked me to introduce Richard Liu, who is our moderator for this webinar. He is a renowned American journalist and news anchor for MSNBC and NBC News. He was formerly with CNN Worldwide. His reporting has focused on humanitarian issues, including gender equality, human trafficking, and affordable housing. His charity work are in similar spaces, and he has been a global ambassador for Plan International USA for its Because I Am a Girl campaign. He is also an ambassador for the Epilepsy Foundation and sits on the President's Council for America's largest food source to the poor, the Food Bank for New York City. His work in reporting on humanitarian issues spans 30 years and 6 continents. He has received many civil rights awards from organizations, including AAJA, WWAAC, and OCA. Forgive me for the acronyms. So without further ado, I would like to have Richard Liu take over and introduce himself, well, not himself, but the panelists.
Hey, Laura, thank you so much. And Jaana as well for doing this. You know, every bit counts, as we understand so much when we're talking about domestic violence. And unfortunately, with all the other layers that we're all living through, you know, this triple decker of tough stuff, it's an important topic. And so we'll focus on, of course, on being as transparent as we can, number one, and number two, to be as specific as we can. And number three, to offer usable, practical snacks, if you will, of information. And that's what our objective will be as we talk about domestic violence living in this COVID era. We've really got some fantastic folks to help us through this. I'll start with Diaz. She is from Milagros Day Worldwide. We also have Mariama Diallo from the Sanctuary for Families. And as you can also see on your slide, Gary Barker from Promundo. And at the very, very bottom there is Adiel Kaplan, NBC News reporter who has covered this space specifically. And thank you all for being here. And if you could each start with why you do what you do in this space. So why do you do what you do in the space, the unfortunate topic of domestic violence? Dawn, why do you do it?
Hello, thank you. So why I do it is really, this was my way of healing myself. I grew up in a household that was very volatile, full of abuse, and this was growing up what I experienced. And so I created this organization in honor of my mom, Milagros. And so I do this to continue to heal myself and heal others in the process. That's really the core why.
That is fantastic. Tell us about what your organization does in 30 seconds.
So Milagros Day Worldwide is a nonprofit that empowers survivors of trauma and abuse, domestic violence being one of those big trauma experiences, but mostly childhood trauma as well. And we empower in a way of leadership. So we teach and coaching and public speaking and entrepreneurial endeavors to survivors so that they can develop their own purpose in life.
Milagros, miracle, huh? And
Yes.
Certainly what you and your mother have done in spirit, right? There at your organization is certainly a miracle. Dawn, great to have you here to talk about this. Gary Barker from Promundo. Gary, why do you do what you do in 30 seconds? And what does Promundo do?
Yeah, 30 seconds. I witnessed a school shooting when I was in high school. And I think we know often about who the shooters are, typically young men. I also, in my university campus first year, there was an incident of a date rape in the dorm that I lived in. And I became increasingly aware of how much young women, particularly around me, had experienced violence from a male partner, how much violence is loaded onto how we define manhood. and how little we as men speak out and work with other men to try to break that cycle. So Promundo does exactly that. We engage men and boys as allies to end violence and to achieve gender equality. That was 45 seconds.
You got it. Thank you, Gary. Good to see you. Mariama Diallo from the Sanctuary for Families. Hey, Mariama.
Hi.
So give us your 30 to 45 seconds, why you do what you do, and what does Sanctuary for Families do?
Well, yes, thank you. So I am from one of the West African countries, speaking French, and I think, you know, the culture where I grew up, domestic violence is something that is normalized. It happened, and it is very difficult for survivors to come forward and talk about their experience because of the fear of being judged, right? So then when I came to the United States, I wanted to work with survivors of gender-based violence. I had a background in law, and then well, I stopped, you know, practicing law, and then I went back to social work school, and I found a job with a Sanctuary for Families. So Sanctuary for Families is a non-for-profit based in New York City. We have offices in all the 5 boroughs, and we work with survivors of gender-based violence in general, not only domestic violence. So the domestic violence could be DV from an intimate partner, but it could be also DV from family members, right? So we work with survivors of trafficking, labor and sex trafficking, and we serve communities from the LGBTQ+. And we have many different departments. I'm not going into this because I may not have enough time, but I will take questions at the end. Thank you.
Fantastic. Yes, and folks who do want to put in your questions, you can go in the chat space and let us know what you think. I think that feature has been turned on there. I'll hear if it's not. And finally, Adiel Kaplan from NBC News, who this is one of the spaces that she reports on. Adiel, what do you do? Why do you do it? Yeah, what? Go for it.
Well, so I'm on NBC's National Investigative Reporting team, and what that means is that I'm often spending time looking at systemic issues and trying to dig deep and uncover what some of the reasons why they're in place. And also one of the biggest edicts in journalism is to, you know, give voice to people who do not have it otherwise. And I've done reporting in the past about systemic problems related to domestic violence and sexual assault and the ways we don't support people, specifically in the US, but the ways we don't support people that are survivors and victims in these scenarios. And that was something that, as we were starting to isolate with coronavirus, became an increasing concern, was, well, what's going to happen now?
We got, and we're lucky to have you here, Adiel, just as we are lucky to have everybody else here, but you've been reporting on this on the front line. Tell us, what is it that you, what are 1 or 2 headlines that would inform all of our panelists and to give us some of the ideas about how to offset what the problem is that you're seeing right now. So tell us 1 or 2 headlines that are the problems that have come about because of COVID.
Well, from all the experts I spoke to across the board, the issue we were hearing was that abusers thrive off of isolating their victims. And while a stay-at-home order is going to protect public health, that is going to further isolate anyone who's already in a domestic abuse situation. And it's also going to make the abusers themselves feel less stable, and that is going to make them lash out more. I'm seeing some of the other panelists nod, so that makes me think I got it right, which is great. And so that was some of the concerns that were being raised initially. And what I was hearing when I started reporting this is I wanted to know what it was like on the ground. We were getting some initial reports of calls going up in some places, but calls going down in other places. So I ended up surveying 35 different domestic violence advocacy and shelter and aid groups across the country. I think they were in 19 states, to hear what was going on. And while call volumes were all over the place, at the end of the day, it was a lot of the same conclusions from everyone, which is that survivors were stuck at home with their abusers during stay-at-home orders, but everywhere was gearing up for what they expected to be an influx in calls and requests for help as places started to open up.
Great, great place to pass it on to Don Diaz. Dawn, what are you seeing in terms of the numbers and what we're hearing from Adiel?
Well, definitely, I mean, she's spot on, and she's getting the information from many different agencies. So that's great to see. One of the things, you know, Milagros, we really focus on after you leave an abusive relationship, where do you go from there, right? And so it takes about, on an average, 7 attempts for a person to leave an abusive relationship. And one of the things that I feel is that now, because it's been so severe and because it's been so concentrated, that those attempts are, I feel that are going to be more urgent, and that a lot of times when the spectrum of domestic violence is not just the severe end of physical abuse. There's the, you know, there's the verbal, there's the emotional, there's the financial, there's the sexual. And so I feel like being confined in this space and having this abusive relationship being so intense during this quarantine, that is like Adiel said, there's going to be a lot more people seeking help and wanting to get out now, because they can't deny it. They're actually going to have to confront themselves that, yes, this is something that I need to move away from.
Gary, what are you hearing?
We've we've just done a national survey together with Oxfam US on household relations and stress during COVID. And I think it's important to stress first that COVID by itself is not a driver of gender-based violence. Men cannot use that as an excuse. It is an additional multiplying factor. But certainly what we do see, the isolation mentioned before, but there's also tremendous stress that households are under. More than 50% of the households in this 1,800 person survey that we carried out have been furloughed, laid off, reduced working hours, which means reduced income. That's 55% for ethnic minorities. A quarter of households are having trouble making ends meet. We've got a third of women and men saying they've given up sleep or rest or self-care during COVID. We've got something close to 60% of households have their children at home with them, so the care burden is higher. So we've got essentially a perfect storm. Again, none of those things are causing violence on their own, but we know that they add to the level of pressure that will push some men toward using violence, or will already aggravate a situation for men who may have already been using violence. So we're both worried about the immediate in terms of how do we help and support. I'm also really worried about this fact. We've got children at home seeing the violence happen. And we know from data across 27 countries where we've done survey research on this, that the single largest factor of an adult man using the meeting against a female partner is if he witnessed it by his father or another man growing up. We've also got the issue of children witnessing the violence that's happening there. And it's really tough for us to both get services to break these cycles when this happens, as well as to think about the prevention work that we are used to doing, because we can't get to men and boys given what lockdown means. So we've got something of a perfect and very frightening storm.
Yeah, and Mariama, something that you understand well, this is not like you can put a shot in the arm and it fixes the problem. This is a time when things get difficult. You start to see the cracks in the pavement. You start to see the pimples. You start to see everything that has not been well seen before. And there's lots of examples that we're living through right now. When you hear the stories and you get the data, as your fellow panelists have expressed right now, how do you react to that? What do you do at the sanctuary to help others? How do you take that in? Because the solutions are often, they take so long.
Yeah, that's true. Number one, I completely agree with the statistics right now, because the numbers have really increased since the pandemic. And at Sanctuary for Families, of course, you know, when you're working with survivors of domestic violence, even before the pandemic, it is extremely challenging, right? So the pandemic made it more challenging for both the survivors as well as the service providers. The survivors, in a way that, you know, at Sanctuary for Families, we work with, you know, survivors who are still in an abusive relationship. So they are inside a house with someone who is abusing them. That is very difficult to engage in counseling because everyone is at home. And, you know, the control is more than what it used to be. The survivor do not have a freedom to make a calls, to, you know, to attend counseling sessions, for example, or speak with attorneys. That's one issue. And another issue, survivors who needs like orders of protection. With the pandemic, of course, like New York, we are lucky that, you know, family court, you know, was able to do orders of protection online, but still it's a lot of victims who have not been able to access many needed services. And if I think about the immigrant community that is already isolated before the pandemic, it made it worse because now they are again isolated from, you know, people who were supportive, and the language barrier is there. It is very difficult for them to go out and ask for help. And of course, we are getting a lot of calls at Sanctuary for Families, but again, this—
What kind of calls are you getting at Mariama? What kind of calls?
Yeah, so the hotline calls, like survivors are calling our hotline numbers. We are open from 9 to 5, but after hours, people can send emails, can text, or call Safe Horizon, right? So we are still getting these calls. We are still screening women and men who are victims of domestic violence. And
what kind of, and sorry to interrupt you, Mariama, I'm very, for our viewers, for those who are here with us, what are they asking for? What are the problems that they're describing to you on the hotline, if you may? Yeah.
Sure. So some of the callers, they are looking for domestic violence shelters where they can move in with their children or single individuals, right? But some of them are already in shelters or at a safe space, but they need like orders of protection or other legal representations. And other calls, it's all about therapy because of the domestic violence. It could be for the whole family, it could be for an adult, or it could be just for the children.
How frantic are these calls, Mariama?
They are extremely, like, you know, traumatic. Sometimes some people can call when the abuser is not far, in fact, and you can get the fear they have because it's about life, it's about saving their lives. Yeah. But in some cases, it's more about the hopelessness you can feel in these calls. Like, where can I go with my children during this pandemic, but we are not safe? So this is how we guide them. We screen by phone and we send, you know, we have locations where we can send them.
Boy, we are lucky to have folks like you, Mariama, and everybody else on this call that are doing this, because that is not easy work. And those hotlines, I know from my reporting in human trafficking, it's as simple as a phone call, but that phone call is at this huge, and it's not a little tiny line, it's like a big tunnel of safety. And that one moment when they call in on the hotline, so important. Adiel, if any of you had the chance to read her fantastic reporting most recently, I'll read the headline. It reads, "It's hard to flee from your domestic abuser during a coronavirus lockdown." This is the subheadline. During the COVID-19 lockdown, calls for help to domestic violence hotlines have grown shorter and more frantic. Adiel, share with us what Mariama was just doing, and what's this frantic notion like, as specific as you can get, and what do you mean by growing shorter?
Well, so what I was hearing from a lot of the providers that I spoke with was that it used to be that often people would call into a domestic violence hotline during the middle of the day when their kids are in school, their partner is at work, they had a little bit of breathing room, they had a little bit of time. But as others were saying, that distance, that separation was no longer there. The person whose story we highlighted in that article, she ended up leaving her husband shortly after the stay-at-home order began in her state because her kids were home and they were suddenly seeing the violence, the verbal abuse, all of that, pardon the background noise. And so what I was hearing from providers around the country was really that they they were getting calls again. They were getting calls, but they were often, you know, very quick because the abuser was in the next room. They were quiet. They were frantically trying to get information out to the helper on the hotline or get some in before they had to hang up so that the abuser wouldn't know. Or in other circumstances, they just weren't able to really help at all. And so a few places we spoke with were setting up text message hotlines if they didn't already have them, or starting to work on that.
Do those work better on Adiel? Do those work better, the text message hotlines? Those work better than the actual phone line? You got to call the number?
Well, if your abuser's in the same room, it's a lot more subtle than speaking on the phone saying, yes, I am in need of domestic violence assistance. So I know that's something that a lot of places I was speaking with, if they had it, they were really grateful they did. If they didn't, they wanted it, but yeah, not so simple to set up if you're a small local domestic violence shelter in, you know, upstate New York somewhere.
Right. Hey, Dawn, you know, what we're talking about, hotlines, so important, whether it be, you know, a voice hotline or a text hotline. You've probably seen the numbers, and we'll say it again, the National Domestic Violence Hotline, according to them, they get about 12, 13,000, correct me if I'm wrong, contacts each week. But in the month of April, they saw a 12% increase, according to the communications director there. 12% increase, and that's earlier on. I don't know what the numbers are looking like now. What's important to remember, and we'll get very practical here on both sides of that phone line or that text, what's most important for those who are in the situation where they do need to reach out to remember when they're considering using a text message or a phone hotline? And what's the most important thing to think on the other side for you as running an organization that may have to answer such questions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like I mentioned before, our mission, like there's so many pieces of this puzzle, and that piece of the puzzle is most usually the first, you know, their threshold into the recovery from being in a domestic violence abusive situation. And so we don't get those direct calls. And whenever we do get calls like that, we do refer them out to places like Safe Horizon, and also to places that are boots on the ground, that actually during the height of the pandemic, the hotlines really weren't working. They weren't getting through. And we actually had grassroots organizations that were getting hotel rooms for survivors just to be able to get out in the meantime before they can get to a shelter. But so for them, before making that move, you have to have a plan. You have to have an escape plan, because that time is the most serious and it's the most dangerous. If the abuser feels that you are planning to leave, that is the time when you can actually be killed, or you can actually be, really, really hurt. So knowing ahead of time. So that would be the most important advice, is like carefully plan your escape, and plan before you reach out, have all your resources ready, so that when you get that call, and I'm sure Mariama can add to that, is that when you get that call, you're ready to go at the right strategic time.
And on the CBO NGO side, know where the resources are. You cannot be an expert in everything, is what you're saying. And so redirect is what you're saying as well, right, Dawn?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we all have our piece of the puzzle, and that is what's going to make the change. Like right now we have police reform, right? So this is, hopefully this will be a threshold into all different types of reform, because grassroots organizations provide a very, very important piece of this puzzle. And then there's prevention, and then there's recovery, right? So crisis intervention is the bulk of what is funded, and budget is a moral document, right? So yes, please fund, the crisis intervention, because that's vital. But then also, what happens after? Where do they go after that they're stabilized? And that's what Milagros Day Worldwide does.
Speaking of the bulk, Gary, is when we look at the 12 million, unfortunately, individuals that are abused every year by their partners, the bulk of those aggressors are men. And coming from a Promundo perspective, is there a quick fix in such situations like COVID? And of course, there are the long-term fixes that everybody is trying to invest in to change the dynamic, which you can mention as well. But are there some shorter-term ways of addressing these individuals, the majority of which are men being the aggressors here?
Yeah, I mean, COVID is an extremely difficult moment for us to reach men before a cycle of violence would already start or get worse. Unfortunately, it's not impossible to say it's late, but it really is a challenging moment. A few countries are trying hotlines where men can also call in if they perceive that they're getting to the edge of, I think I might cause harm to myself, if it's suicide ideation, for example, or to my partner, my children. A few countries are trying that. The demand has definitely shot up in a few countries that we're in touch with and support partners. Costa Rica, Chile is another example. There is an important thing that men who—
Gary, talk about that. That's not a frequently brought up topic of hotlines for aggressors, potential aggressors that feel that they're about to break. Yeah. Give me another 60 seconds on that.
Well, the challenge is that the violence doesn't fall out of the air. Typically, there's a cycle that it builds, often starting with psychological, often starting with controlling behaviors, and then it may turn into physical and sometimes escalating. So the challenge, of course, is that we are socialized most of the time as men not to seek help and not to pay attention when we are reaching that point that we lose control and begin using a cycle of violence. So it does require a lot of promotion of, hey, this number exists, call, this is not normal, you can reach out for help. And there's a huge cultural issue there of saying men are allowed to reach out for help. It's also really challenging in moments like this to say, if we can barely staff the hotlines for women survivors, who do we have to staff? Where's the funding to staff a hotline for men? But I do think it is important. Some of these are volunteer efforts, the ones that we know in Chile and Costa Rica. There's a few that are funded in the Nordic countries, and there's a few in the US that are trying to do that. I think they need some more attention, but we've also got to make sure that we know about them. And that's where I think the issue of engaging other men to speak out, what we call bystander intervention programs, so that if I see that my brother, my uncle, a neighbor, a work colleague is losing it, we mostly want to look away as men because we have also felt men's violence and we mostly want to turn away from that. But the importance of whatever setting where we encounter other men, workplace is one that we've done a lot of training around, to engage men to be partners in calling out other men, to say, it looks like you might be losing it. You need some help. I think that's something we could do more of during COVID and not consider that we, that there are lots of men around watching the violence or who know about the violence that could intervene in thoughtful ways.
Let's build on that, Mariama. What would you suggest for those bystanders, right? Those individuals that may think that there is a potentially explosive situation about to happen. What would you tell folks from the sanctuary perspective? Consider this or go here to get those ideas.
Like, can you clarify a little so I understand the question? Sorry.
Yeah, so Gary was bringing up the bystander intervention training.
Yes.
We might hear something through our apartment walls. We are noticing a couple that's out in the street or in the building that you're in, because we're not out in the street. But that idea of, oh, I think, what's your reaction to that bystander intervention training?
Well, I think it's very important that people realize if we want to end domestic violence, it's not a role from just one individual. This is not a role because women are more victims. It's not a job just for women. And men need to play a very important role. And we know when we're talking about bystanders, it's not only men who are going to bystand, in fact. It is many people who are still feeling like, you know, domestic violence is still, it's weird. It is a crime, but some people still feel like, oh, it may be a problem in the family and I'm not going to get involved. And that is a problem, in fact. We need to see this as, you know, a public health issue. We need to see domestic violence as an issue that will affect the whole, like a society, our communities. And we cannot be a bystander, because if you don't play that role, it is going to be perpetuated. You teaching other people around you that it is okay to close your eyes at someone who needs help. It doesn't matter if it's your sister or your brother. Remember, this is a community problem. And if you see something, say something. Don't just be there and feel like, no, it's a family problem. It's more than a family problem. It is a crime. It is really affecting families, not only one individual. It is affecting children. It is affecting everyone. I think domestic violence is one of the issues that do not discriminate based on your race or your social economic status or your level of education. It is everywhere. So we all need to be aware of, we all have a role to play if we want to see the end. It
is everywhere. And we hate to say that. Adiel, you've been speaking on your reporting, and you've met others who've been reporting on this space. What surprised you as an investigative reporter? And for all of those who aren't journalists in our Zoom room, being an investigative reporter is one of those holy grails. You want to be in NBC investigations, so you've seen a lot. So over to you, Adiel. You've seen a lot in your reporting in Miami, in Florida before that, now with us nationally. What surprised you as you've been covering this space of domestic violence?
Well, I actually got into this space, into covering it initially looking at the financial side of things. My first big story about domestic violence was about a misuse of funds by Florida's largest domestic violence nonprofit, funding millions of dollars in executive pay instead of giving it directly to shelters. So the first thing that came to my mind during coronavirus was, what's going to happen to the money here? These places are going to need a lot more money. And what I found is, as an investigative reporter, you end up getting really excited about things that are very terrible, because it usually means, you found the corruption. So you're cheering when, you find that document that shows it, even though the document shows something very bad. Yeah. So in this case, it was actually, reporting on domestic violence was actually kind of a positive experience to me, because I was just talking to all these groups doing really great work and coming up with really creative, innovative solutions to
inspirational, right?
Problem. Yeah, people creating text message hotlines, partnering with hotels more than ever, getting new grants to house people, figuring out how to sneak money to people in their grocery deliveries from Instacart, things like that. But one thing we were hearing was that the funding is just, a lot of cases, they were getting an influx of community funding right away. The local area, if they were really well embedded in it, knew that they were going to need help, and they were getting that. But they were more concerned for 6 months from now, because they knew cases were going to go up, that more people were going to seek help. And as I'm sure everyone in the nonprofit sector is aware, funding is a lot more up in the air for everyone than it has been. And this is a particular area where I think the need is only growing, and the need for that long-term support and the ability to just more outreach than ever. And this concern that, well, what if the DOJ money, it was already going to change? And that's where a lot of DOJ being Department of Justice, that's where a lot of funding for domestic violence work comes from for grassroots groups. Well, if that's already changing and suddenly there's less local donors, people have less money to give, what does the budget look like for 2021?
Adiel, quickly, you were talking about innovative reactions and solutions. What was one that really stood out to you that you have reported on?
I really liked I think it was a group in Ohio that was, as I mentioned, giving money directly to survivors by sneaking into their groceries. I think there was another one in Long Island.
Sneaking it into their groceries, just.
Yeah, there's another one in Long Island that was meeting people at the grocery store because it was the one place where they were going. And, you know, standing 6 feet apart, but talking to them, giving them some resources. And the ones that really seemed to make the biggest difference, though, that the groups were most proud of were the text message hotlines. And I guess I shouldn't compare apples to apples on what made the biggest difference, but that really seemed a key component there, is that if it wasn't a text message hotline, it was suddenly they were manning their Facebook Messenger all the time. You know, however people could reach them without having to speak and alert their abuser that they were seeking help and seeking assistance.
Wow, it's always something else. Dawn, what do you think about all of this?
Well, it's great that we're all here together and that all of these, that we have journalists that are uncovering a lot of these things. And I think that we have to prepare for what's coming in the next few months, as I said before, when people are able to, make that decision for themselves. And then are we going to be able to give them the resources that they need, immediate resources like the housing, like the, food and shelter assistance, and then the long-term assistance, which is really the most important thing, or, it's actually like the next logical step for them to really change their lives and move forward and not go back, because that's also a revolving door where you end up going either back to that same relationship or to another abusive relationship if you don't change your mindset and change what you believe that you're worth. And so, the funding, it needs to go to all the different pieces of the puzzle.
Great stuff. We got some great questions. I'm going to get to those right after I ask Gary a quick one here. So any of you in the room, go ahead, please go ahead and put more questions in the chat area. I see them and I'm going to get to them so long as my eyes are open right now. Gary, I wanted to ask you this because it's sat in the back of my mind. There was a young man, his name was John. He was just graduated from high school, and he decided, this is in some of my reporting on gender equality, and he's in Uruguay. And he decided, because he knew if he got his girlfriend pregnant, he would be the man and she would be the hoe, using his words. And he said, I'm going to do something about this. And I'm going to start an after-school program. Mind you, I'm in South America here, for other high school boys to come and learn about what it really does mean to be a man. And to stand up for equality between boys and girls. And then that brought me forward to when I was driving in Michigan. I was out filming and I was filling up our crew van with gas, waiting in line. The guy sees me coming, I'm in a rush. He says, go ahead, 6'3", on the phone. And he says, go ahead, Rich, go ahead. Thank you. And what happens is, then he continues his conversation with his friend and he says, oh yeah, man, I know you've had a really rough day. No problem. Just go home, slap her around a little bit, just push around, get it out. It'll all be okay. Just do it. And I was thinking to myself, okay, you're this guy that reports on this space. You volunteer in the space, Richard. What do? Do you say something right now? 6'2", 6'3", got 100 pounds on me at least. Do I say something now? Is that the right thing to do? What do I do, Gary? Do I be John and go out and volunteer more? Or do I say something right now? Or do I do both and a lot more?
Yeah, both and a lot more. That's the obvious answer. I think it's all those moments, right? It's the going upstream to get boys while they're learning ideas about manhood, and often very negative ones, either from TV or a high percentage that we know are seeing the opposite of consent when they are watching porn. We know the number of cues they're getting often at home, that boys who witness such violence growing up are 2 to 3 times more likely to carry it out as adults. And we know how much that most of the time we as men and boys don't intervene when we see the cycle. So I think it's all the above. And you know, there is that fear because we as men know the violence that other men can use. One of our key points about bystander interventions is don't try to do it alone. Don't try to prove that you've got to be the savior, the hero of the day. It's got to be, I'm not saying get a group and go beat him up. I'm saying go together with others. You know, you shouldn't have had to do that on your own to question. That should be several folks saying, hey, maybe this is not a good thing. Let's distract, let's talk you down. Let's think about, you know, how do you feel about this? So all the above and more was the right answer.
Yeah, it was a tough one. Now, as we've gone through our latest phase, both across the country and around the world, I know that intervention guides are out there.
Yeah.
And my suggestion to those to be ready for situations like that, because they come up, unfortunately, all the time where you might be able to say something, is to look it up. There's a bunch of them that give you like 5 steps. You know, I think it's the 5 Ds is one of them too. Just distract, for instance. I could have distracted him. I could have started talking about something else. I could have started talking to him about it. Direct, right? There's all sorts of different ways of. So I would to everybody, get out there, find those bystander guides. They're super helpful. I now have a couple of those in my brain. All right, let me get to some of the questions here. And so Diane asks, so what is the best way to take action as a bystander? I see you, Diane. And so maybe Mariama, you can give us one idea. I know you were talking about it earlier, but based on what I was saying just now, do you have a quick tip here about if I'm in that situation, what I could do?
Well, I think, as I said, it's really recognizing it as a universal problem that we have a role to play. But again, I think the example you gave make me think about your safety at the same time. If you want to act, think about what may happen before you act, because your safety also is very important, right? Don't feel like you're going to be the hero and you're going to save everyone at like one time overnight. Changing things may take time. Just to take one step at a time and think about your safety as well.
Yeah, I mean, I kicked myself, Mariama, for days and days and days. And then I realized, see something, say something. The say something doesn't mean what we all think it might mean. There's like, at least as I was mentioning, 4 or 5 different ways to say that something.
There are many ways.
Yeah.
Like, even if you cannot go straight away to the person and talk, think about involving yourself in policy change, in fact.
Yeah.
You know, get into, you know, call your representatives, talk about how can you support your own community because you see it in your community. And remember, it's not only your role, you're not the only one in the community. So just involving a little people, like some people, small group, as small as it could be, or reaching out to people who have been working in this field for a long time to learn better. How can I do this? How can I do outreach? How can I help in my community? I think that's going to be very important.
One of the things, Adiel, that in covering human trafficking over the years is we don't talk about the Johns. We don't talk about the people that are doing this stuff enough. I mean we, and not you, but me as a reporter, I would get mad at myself because I was always focusing, and I saw it around me as well, focusing on the victims and what sometimes leads to victim blaming, not intentionally, sometimes intentionally, victim glorification. There's all sorts of problems that we fall into when we get into these spaces. Have you also seen the same? And as a follow-on to that, how would you suggest that we discuss the aggressors better?
Oh, sorry. Is the question, it's for who the question? It's
Adiel.
Sorry.
That's okay, Mariama.
You're fine. You probably know more about this than I do, but I'll do my best.
No, I'm not. I'm so sorry. I'm going to continue. I'm sorry to jump.
Well, so some of the programs that I spoke to for this particular story, one of the areas they were most concerned about was their outreach programs to potential aggressors. They're programs that they had working with people that had already had some sort of domestic violence record. And, you know, there was, I think, a group in Tarrant County, Texas, had a very well-established program working with abusers and helping them through different kinds of counseling, and just really that county in particular had a lot of wraparound services, and they were concerned about those groups not being as effective, about those outreach efforts really not being able to come through during such a time of isolation. And that gets to a lot of what Gary has been saying this whole time, is that some of these domestic violence service providers, you know, they're doing so much more than just providing a shelter. They're providing all kinds of services, whether it's counseling for survivors, counseling for abusers. They're providing temporary housing assistance, not just through the form of shelters, but there was a group in Rhode Island that had a housing program where they helped people find new housing, and if needed, they could provide rental assistance. They said they got more requests for rental assistance in a single week in April than they had, I think, like more than double the amount they normally get in a month. And so it was a lot of stuff like that where these groups are doing a lot to try to reach everyone. And I think that speaks to what everyone on this panel has been saying, but we don't often talk about the efforts that go into trying to stop the abuse before it happens, because in journalism, it's so much harder to tell a compelling story about something that didn't happen.
Yeah, I hear you. What do you need as an organization? If you got one wish at this hour on this day, what would it be? And I'm going to get back to the questions. Thank you all who are asking questions. I'm going to get as a couple more. But if there was one thing that you got that one wish, you rub that magic genie bottle and poof, you get one, who would like to start?
Well,
Dawn, go for it.
so you mentioned the questions, and I did see two questions that I really would like to answer very quickly. And also I want to acknowledge Kota for highlighting Milagros Day Worldwide to raise funds today. And so if I had a wish, it would really be to, Adiel mentioned giving a voice to the victims, right? And so our biggest program right now is Healing Voices. It's actually like the next Vagina Monologues. So it's basically having the survivors, giving them a platform for them to tell their stories. And it ties into some of the questions that I heard, where there was one question that said, how do you convince somebody that they're in an abusive relationship? You don't convince them. You let them hear other stories of survivors so that they can identify themselves and be able to come forward, because you can't convince anybody of where they are, right? And then another question was, how do you take the taboo away from the subject of domestic violence? That was also in the questions. And that is the shame, right? So when you give somebody the platform to tell their story, and when you actually let them understand that their story is just an experience, that's not who they are. And that's when the taboo goes away, because that means they don't identify with themselves with that experience, and therefore they don't feel that shame of that experience, and they'll be able to separate themselves from the experience and be able to tell that story and then move forward with who they really are and not be paralyzed. So the wish is to get this platform, to give attention and to give media attention to the platform of Healing Voices.
How much money you need for that program?
Well, I mean,
give it to me.
I mean, it's not that big actually. My goal right now for this campaign is $50,000, and I mean, we actually raised during the pandemic. We raised $10,000, which was amazing. And to see that people were unemployed, that people were, you know, in all of these situations, but they knew that this was important enough for them to give whatever they could. And so this campaign that we're running right now, our goal is 50,000.
Great, great, great. Gary, quickly, give me 30 seconds. What's your wish?
Take healthy masculinity training into every school in the country, starting at elementary level and continuing through high school.
That's great. You know, something I want to ask you though, and that's a great program and idea. I'll call up John in Uruguay for you. Okay. Yeah, I'll get him. We'll activate him. Remark quickly on this idea of male privilege.
Yeah. Well, you know, the notion that we've got 20% more income, we are more likely to be in charge of corporations and businesses, that we are the default when it comes to health services and health testing around the world, that we carry more physical space and physical strength often as we walk into rooms. All those things are things that we as men have to check and question, and in non-defensive ways. And I think part of what we do in that healthy masculinity training is get men to be aware of that, because it feels invisible to lots of men. Lots of men feel like, well, that guy's got privilege, but I don't. So it is part of a self-awareness process that we try to get men at all levels involved in, whether you're a senator in the US Senate or whether you work as a primary school teacher in a neighborhood. To get men to be aware of that privilege, I think is a great start for dismantling and being part of the solution.
Thank you so much, Gary. Mariama, to you, what's your 30-second wish? And how do you break the taboo surrounding domestic violence? That question coming from Anne.
Yeah, okay. So my wish, I wish that my wish going to be really realized by tomorrow, but I would love to see more services for survivors of domestic violence. Because like in New York, where I work, it's a limit. People think we have everything in New York, but we are still dealing with a lot of challenges when we are, you know, serving the survivors. Like shelter, we have many domestic violence shelters, but the calls are more than, you know, the spaces, like what they call the tier 2 domestic violence shelter. We have a very limited spaces for victims of domestic violence, right? So to break the taboo, to go back to that question, I think what have been very successful for Sanctuary for Families is the community outreach and education. Going within the communities where this is happening and talk about it, educate people about the impact and how it manifests, and also the services out there, because the fear of the unknown sometimes keep people in abusive relationship because they are worried about what they can get out there. So by going to the community, talking about the services, normalizing this, saying, yes, this is happening, but it is not your fault. We are here to support. Maybe that can break the taboo.
Really quickly here, Gary, this is a question about those victims, those survivors who are male, and how to address that segment of domestic violence. And in addition to that, you were talking about sensitivity programs. Does it help to reduce domestic violence? And then we're going to finish up.
Sure, there are networks of, I would say, Google Male Survivor. There's a network of male survivor programs, and many of the good shelter support programs for women as well will also do referrals for men who are survivors. That would be the simplest way. I don't know the full network of those services in New York, but I would Google Male Survivor, the US network that works on that topic, and I would turn the question to those who operate shelter programs that often have therapists and counseling programs that they also make referrals for. We do know that what we call gender transformative programming, engaging boys and young men in schools, can work. We've done some impact evaluation studies of those. Other programs in the US, Mentors in Violence Prevention, Futures Without Violence, Call to Men, we all have some evidence-based curricula that work. A key point I would add as well is the importance of differentiating that kind of all boys need that sensitization, but some boys are more likely to grow up and be violent toward their partner, particularly those who witnessed it growing up. And that's where interventions like Expect Respect and our program called Youth Living Peace that particularly recruit boys who already show signs of using dating violence and typically have already witnessed violence at home. We need a different kind of prevention program for those boys as well as for girls who are already witnessing violence at home. So I think it's a two-tiered approach. We'd call that primary prevention and secondary prevention, but there are good models for both. And I think those need to go hand in hand.
It is 7 o'clock in New York City. And if you're here in Manhattan, you are used to hearing people hooting and hollering. If I didn't happen to be here with you fine folks, I would be doing the very same thing out this window. So it's a great way to finish our conversation before I throw it back over to Laura and Jaana, is who would you salute in this space, in the domestic violence space, with this whole wrapper of COVID around us today? Who would you salute? And I'll start with you, Adiel.
Well, not to be cliche, but again, the on-the-ground grassroots domestic violence groups are just true heroes. You know, most of them, most may not be the right word, but many of them operate on what we'd call a shoestring budget. You know, they're just trying to keep their doors open and their lights on and be able to provide services to as many people as possible. The phrase I heard the most often in this reporting was, "We don't want to have to turn anyone away." And so people that are trying so hard to make sure that they're there whenever someone does pick up the phone or send a text or show up and needs help, that's who I salute.
Fantastic. Mariama, who would you salute?
Well, I think the survivors as well, honestly, because they have the courage to pick up a phone and make a call or send a text to ask for help.
That is great. Gary.
Oof, where to start? Yeah, I've just provided some examples there of curricula. You know, I think I probably salute Jackson Katz, who runs Mentors in Violence Prevention, has really been taking this into military and sports, really trying to break some of the cycles and the cultures where we see a lot of concentration of men's violence. So there's one of the materials that I shared right there.
Great. Thank you. Dawn, who would you salute?
Well, all of those people, especially the survivors, like Mariama said, but definitely groups like Kota, like the Global Sisterhood. There are organizations that their sole purpose is to support grassroots groups. You know, to give us the voice, to give us the platform, to give us the collective, the network. And so that's really who I would salute right now. Mm-hmm.
I salute you, Dawn. I salute you, Gary. I salute you, Mariama. I salute you, Adiel. I salute you, Jaana. I salute you, Laura. I salute one of the board members specifically. Since I asked a question, I'll answer. Judith Register is a board member of Kota, and she is the reason why I question myself. When I went back about that time getting gas, why do I keep on questioning myself? And I'm glad she brought me into Plan 6-7 years ago, and she's never let her claws out of me. That's good, because she keeps on inspiring and training me. And that's what I'm glad about, because I keep on wondering, am I doing the right thing? And it pushes me to learn, pushes me to do things like this. So a salute to Judy, if she is here. Back to you, my friends, Jaana and Laura.
Thank you. We salute you all. And thank you, Richard, for doing this great conversation, leading this great conversation. And we have recorded it, so we're going to put it online, and then you can share it further if you like.
Yeah, thank you, Richard, and everyone on the panel. It was fantastic, learned a lot. And I agree with you, Richard, about Judy. She challenges us, and it's wonderful.
Get out of the way, as they say. All right, good night all, and thank you.
Thank you all.